Thanks for joining us today. I was going to talk for a little bit about long COVID and some of the strategies that we've been looking at to try to help that. Just for a little bit of your background, I'm a sort of classically trained physician and was actually practicing in critical care for the last 8 years. And so that included all through the COVID pandemic. And so I saw a lot of what COVID did to patients from an inpatient hospital standpoint. But I also had a lot of colleagues who got COVID early on in the pandemic, and some of them ended up with long COVID. And they got pretty extensive workups from a standard medicine standpoint, and nobody was really figuring out anything that was helpful as far as treatment. And I felt like there just had to be something that we could do for them. So I've been interested in this for probably almost 3 years now. And I just wanted to be able to share with you the things that I've looked at. So first of all, what is long COVID? And there are a bunch of different definitions, some of which are talk about symptoms for 3 months. Some of them talk about symptoms just for a month after your infection. This is the CDC definition, which is referring to symptoms after 4 weeks. And they talk about it being potentially relapsing and remitting in a multisystemic syndrome that could have many different symptoms. That's not very specific, but they do at least acknowledge that it's that it is an issue for an awful lot of patients. And when you look at the World Health Organization, they describe it as something that some symptoms that started and have continued at least 3 months afterwards, and they're estimating between 10 and 20% of those people infected by COVID. And since we assume that almost everyone has now been infected by COVID or been exposed to COVID at least, that's a huge percentage of the population. Even if you were to say that they're wildly wrong on their percentages and that it's really only 1% of people, it's still a lot of people if you look at how many people have been exposed to COVID. And as far as the symptoms, you can pull up any number of infographics and diagrams and things where people summarize the different symptoms, but I think the big ones are fatigue, and people talk about post-exertional fatigue where they're okay until they try and do something and then they just crash. Dyspnea or shortness of breath is a significant problem for a lot of patients, and brain fog or inability to think or concentrate or maintain focus if you need to work for a full day. Some people are having difficulty sleeping or changes in their taste and smell that aren't resolving. Some of them have aches and pains and arthralgias, some irritation of the throat, persistent headaches. POTS and autonomic dysfunction is effectively a dysregulation in the nervous system control of some of your organs. So in order for you to not get lightheaded when you stand up, your brain has to send signals down to the blood vessels in your legs that say, hey, we just stood up, so we need the blood vessels to constrict a little bit so that all the blood doesn't pool in your feet and you don't get lightheaded. And that autonomic control, or that nervous system control, affects a lot of different organs. So it affects the blood vessels, it affects the heart and the heart rate, it affects when your body knows to sweat and not sweat, and to control temperature regulation. So it's a pretty broad spectrum of symptoms. A lot of people are having different GI symptoms, and these can really vary. And they also vary depending on when people had COVID, because there have been so many different variants of COVID that seem to have more or less GI side effects depending on which version they got. Some people can have skin manifestations and mood changes, with depression and anxiety being very common. And so it really is a very broad spectrum. And I show this diagram basically to try to explain one of the theories about why it is so multifactorial. We know that COVID gets in through the ACE2 receptors, and originally we talked about ACE2 receptors being in the lungs, but really they are all over the body. And one of the things I think is the most significant is that they're also in the blood vessels. And so if you look at the lining of the capillary vessels, we have capillaries everywhere in every single organ system. So you have capillary networks in your brain, in your liver, in your kidneys, in your muscles. And if there's some problem with inflammation in the lining of the capillaries, and so you're not getting great blood flow through the capillaries, that's going to hit potentially every organ in your body. I mean, we know that there are ACE2 receptors in the heart tissue, and that can be associated with some of the chest pains and pressure that people are feeling, or different irregularities in their heart rate control. There are some in the brain. And so whether there's a question of whether or not that's contributing to brain fog, it really is a very multisystemic disease, and it can be multisystemic for a lot of different reasons. When I think about COVID, certainly I saw acute COVID in the ICU, which I hope never to see anything like that again. But if you think of the number of patients that were infected and the number of them that ended up with these not life-threatening, but just debilitating illnesses where they can't go back to work and they're having trouble returning back to their life, or their depression or anxiety has just gotten out of control and they can't get it back into control. This is millions and millions of Americans. And some of the estimates from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services are between 7 and 23 million Americans. And, that's a wide range, but regardless, it is a very, very large number of patients. And my colleagues who had long COVID, who were trying to have this treated with kind of the best of testing that was available within standard medicine, really weren't coming up with any solutions. And so I think continuing to look for alternatives was really important. The Brookings Institute looked at kind of the financial impact of this, and there are so many patients who really do have severe symptoms and then can't work. And they're estimating about 4 million people being out of work because of these residual symptoms from long COVID. So what are we going to do about that from the perspective of the patient? Like, how do you return them back to their regular life? How do you fix that from the standpoint of the healthcare system? Because these patients are being seen by all sorts of specialists to look for some treatment, and they're really not getting anywhere. And that's also an incredible number of patients to be within the medical system trying to get care. And how do we try to address that as a country, as an individual, as a physician, as if you're a family member and you're trying to take care of your family or your children or your parents? So anybody who's in this webinar probably understands this already, but it is one of the reasons I think it's such a compelling thing to look at. If you look at the economic costs, they are up in the trillions of dollars, which is honestly more than I can really comprehend, but certainly it's something that as a country we need to think about. When they look at the impact, some of the other estimates are saying, 1 in 13 adults, or like 7.5%, have long COVID symptoms, and that this is affecting a lot of working age adults. And it's actually affecting adults in their 50s a lot more than it is affecting our more elderly population, the patients who are older than 80. And so it's hitting the patients that are still very active in taking care of their children and trying to work, potentially the age range where they're also trying to take care of their aging parents. We see it affects women more than men. And there are some significant racial disparities where nearly 9% of Hispanics are dealing with long COVID. And one of the things that COVID really made me think about as a physician myself is kind of what our medical system is designed to identify. And, back when Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin, this was his blockbuster medication, and it was essentially the magic bullet for patients who were dying of sepsis from Staph aureus. And at that time, it was a very almost linear cause and effect, where you had a staph infection, and if we had a drug that killed staph, it would save your life. And if we didn't, then you would die. And so that change in the way we thought about medicine made us think like, okay, well, let's go find the magic drug for this, and let's find the magic drug for that. And you would have seen during COVID, like there was, well, what's the magic drug for COVID? And eventually that moved more towards what's the vaccine for COVID. But I don't really think there's going to be a magic drug for long COVID. And if you look at the clinicaltrials.gov, which includes every clinical trial in the US that's funded by NIH, you can search for studies on long COVID. And right now there are 44 studies that are being funded and are recruiting. And I think they're very helpful, but they're all looking for an individual thing, because when you design a study, you're looking for one variable that you can change and see if you can find a significant impact. So some of them are looking for things like viral persistence, and was there still a reservoir of COVID in your body? Is there some role for Paxlovid to try to address that viral persistence? Are there some individual supplements that can help? Would mindfulness training help? Is there different brain stimulation or stem cells? But all of these are kind of individual therapies. And in order to find an effect, you need a very large number of patients to identify an effect. If it's going to be a small effect, they're pretty expensive studies to run, and they take a long time to identify. And if I do my study right now in 2023, and I'm looking at the viruses that are circulating in 2023, by the time that anything were to be published in 2025, there'll be a different virus out. So it's really hard to use that information over time because the virus keeps changing. And as an alternative way to look at healthcare, I think there's really more of a complex management. So, okay. So this background in the back that looks a little bit like a subway map, my goal is not for you guys to be able to read this chart, but this is a diagram of the human metabolism. And so it shows all sorts of enzymes and different biochemical reactions where one thing leads to the next, to the next, to the next, and anything that you manipulate is going to have downstream effects somewhere else. The same way that if you tried to pluck one single fiber on that spider web, you're going to move an awful lot of things downstream. And so trying to figure out how do we go about approaching something that is this complicated, and where do we even get started? And that's really where I think functional medicine has a really good role, because you're looking at how things are affecting a patient, that individual patient, rather than a cohort of 100 or 500 patients. And what can you optimize about that patient? If I think about some of the potential mechanisms for long COVID, there are a lot of different theories. So this particular diagram doesn't include all of them, but they talk about viral persistence or reactivation of latent viruses. So like viruses that have been in your system for a long time, but aren't causing you a problem until you get COVID. There's a concern that it can trigger the initiation of autoimmunity, and then how do we slow down that autoimmune attack, and where is that coming from? We know that it disturbs the balance of gut microbiome, or the gut bacteria in your intestine, and what downstream effects is that having? If we're seeing downstream tissue damage from the original infection, is the tissue damage itself and all of these like damaged cellular debris that's floating around, is that initiating more of an autoimmune response? There's a significant concern about microclots forming in the capillaries and preventing good blood flow. And there are some patients who are more prone to that than others because they're more prone to form clots in general. And so is that the clot itself that's the problem, or the low levels of oxygen in the tissue that's causing a problem? We know that there's a significant effect on the mitochondria, and these are the powerhouses of the cell, where you look at the energy production within the cell. And if that's been affected, that's going to affect an awful lot of things downstream. It looks like it affects the production of nitric oxide, which is something that helps our blood vessels dilate. So they know, like, if I need more blood flow in this area, you release nitric oxide and the vessels get a little bit larger, so you get more blood flow. Well, you need to have that nitric oxide responsiveness for that system to work. You need a glutathione, which is our primary antioxidant in our body. And infections in general can deplete glutathione, but certainly COVID just knock the patient's glutathione levels through the floor. And if you ended up with significant enough oxidative damage, which can actually contribute to the mitochondrial problems, then how do you recover from that? One of the other concerns is a persistent cell danger response. And I'll get into all of these a little bit later and try to explain them in more detail. But if you look at the complexity here, I don't think there's going to be one drug or one solution that's going to be the answer. And I think it's hard to design a study around this, because if you have a patient who has, say, 4 of these factors are really significant for that patient, but they're enrolled in a study that's only looking at one factor instead of the 4 that are important in that patient, and every patient in the study has a different set of 4 factors that are important for them, how do you prove something is effective? So if I would just go through and start talking about some of the different thoughts. One of them is the microclots. And we know that clots are in part made of fibrin. And so fibrin, if your body has a predisposition either for laying down fibrin more so than the average person, or else breaking it down more slowly than the average person, then you're going to form more clots. So you can get microclots. You also can have an increased propensity to form biofilms. And I'll show you some pictures of this in a minute. And both of these, I think, are potential mechanisms that could contribute to long COVID. So if we look at clots in general, these little like red donut-shaped discs would be the red cells, and all of this white spaghetti stuff on top of them would be fibrin. And this is an electron microscope or micrograph of a clot, where you have some red cells and some platelets and a bunch of fibrin all gluing it together, and that's how your body forms normal clots. And this second picture with the highlights in green are showing what the blood looks like for a patient who has a normal patient. So this first set of blocks that are labeled A, these are from controlled patients, and this is plasma. So basically the liquid component of your blood when they spin it out. And so they're not looking at the cells, they're looking at the liquid. Normally you wouldn't really expect to see much there, and they don't. So it's mostly black. And if you look at a comparison, these are just patients who have diabetes. And by comparison, they don't have much stuff floating around in their blood. But then if you look at patients who have COVID, they have an awful lot of these little microclots that are forming. And you see these same microclots that are persistent in patients that have long COVID. That same propensity to form clots and the persistence of the fibrin, which can then become fibrin that's got a different format called an amyloid format that's just harder to break down. That same tendency to form those clots can also help form this kind of yellowish goo. So this is a diagram of biofilms, and this is an entirely separate theory about just chronic infections in general. And so in this diagram, they're showing you bacteria rather than viruses, but we think the process is similar. And if you have free-floating bacteria in your system, they're pretty susceptible to antibiotics. They're pretty susceptible to the immune system and attacks from white blood cells. And so it's easier to kill off these, they call them planktonic bacteria, or they're just floating around on their own. But if they attach to something, so we know this is an issue for people with chronic urinary infections, they can attach to the inside of the bladder, for example, and then start to accumulate this extracellular matrix around them. And so there's like they're kind of building a house around these bacteria. And as this gets larger and larger, you get these little colonies of bacteria that are surrounded by a matrix, and they then become better able as a group to fight off the immune system. The white blood cells can't penetrate this as easily. Antibiotics can't penetrate it as easily. They've actually shown that you can get some pumps on the surface, on the surface of these extracellular membranes or the biofilms that will pump antibiotics back out. So even though you want to give antibiotics, this little structure is kind of protecting it because it's continually shipping them out. You also get an altered pH within these structures, which is more healthy for the bacteria, but it makes it harder for our white blood cells to be effective. And so once these things form, it's much harder to kill off whatever's living there. And this can be bacteria, but we also know viruses have been found in this, and spirochetes, like the Lyme spirochete, has been found in biofilms. And we suspect that this is a component to a lot of chronic infections that seem to flare. And when they flare, you have symptoms and you give antibiotics and everything seems to clear up. And so that's kind of this process where things are breaking apart. And then it kind of goes quiescent or dormant for a little while till it flares again, but you don't actually eradicate it from your system. And people talk about a persistent COVID reservoir, and we think that's part of what may be happening, where people get biofilms, and you can get biofilms in your teeth, in your nose, in the surface in your lungs, like in your gut, on your bladder. You can get them to form all over the place. And it's not just one organism that lives there. You get multiple organisms there, and that can include viruses. And we suspect that it can include COVID virus. And so if you have some patients that have this persistent source of COVID, is this continuing to drive ongoing inflammation? And what is the clinical significance of all of this? And how do you treat this? We talked some more about the fibrin, and this goes back to the fibrin clots. And this is a little bit of a complicated diagram, but basically what I wanted to show you is that you get these fibrin clots that can form as an amyloid structure, which is just the way the fibrin packages itself together. And it packages it in such a way that it's much harder for it to dissolve. That can trigger a lot of inflammation. So some people get problems with mast cell activation. That's where you get histamine release for lots of little minor triggers that normally wouldn't release histamine. You can get these microclots that are blocking some of the capillaries, so you're not getting good blood flow to different areas in the body, which can lead to more tissue breakdown. It can lead to some of the shortness of breath and breathlessness that people have, and also some of the fatigue symptoms and the muscle aches, because you can imagine if you're trying to work out and your muscles aren't getting enough oxygen, that's not going to feel great. And in the same way, that can lead to some dysfunction in the brain where you're not really thinking clearly because you're not getting appropriate blood flow into the tissue. And it may also be involved in the breakdown of the blood-brain barrier, which is one of the protective barriers within our system that helps the body kind of isolate the brain so that toxins that may be floating around your system in general are being screened and they're not as likely to get to the brain tissue. Well, that works as long as that barrier is functioning, but can these fibrin amyloid microclots start to break that structure down as well? And when I think about what do we do to try to help treat the microvascular system, there are a number of things that I think can potentially be helpful. So certainly anticoagulation comes to mind. And those would be things like blood thinners. So if anybody, has atrial fibrillation, they're very likely to be on a blood thinner to help decrease the risk of clots forming and leading to strokes. And so there are anticoagulants that affect the clotting factors in the bloodstream. There are also antiplatelet agents, which affect how sticky the platelets are. And so those are things like aspirin and Plavix. Those are both antiplatelet agents. There are some things we use in functional medicine that help break down the fibrin. I am a little hesitant to use the word fibrinolytic because in the ER, if I tell you, if you come in with an acute stroke and I give you a fibrinolytic, it's a very, very strong medication that will just break down a clot almost immediately to try to help you recover from an acute stroke or an acute heart attack. That's called TPA, and that's not what we're referring to in functional medicine. There are some enzymes that help kind of normalize how your body deals with fibrin rather than just dissolving it all to open up a clot. It just makes it easier for your body to break it down on its own. So there's several strategies to deal with the clots themselves. There are also strategies to help try to get more blood flow into the tissue. So if you imagine you're exercising and you can exercise with oxygen, and whenever you exercise, you're increasing your heart rate. And so your heart's pumping faster and faster, and you're going to get more blood flow into all the tissues. If you do that, is that improving the perfusion to the capillary beds? And are there some ways where you can exercise with different levels of oxygen and you can flush oxygen into your system? I think that's promising. Certainly, we can support the nitric oxide production, so your ability for the blood vessels to dilate or get a little larger. There's some ways to support that. There's some ways to support something called the glycocalyx, which is like this little slippery lining, almost like a Teflon coating within the blood vessels to help protect the endothelial cells, which are the cells lining those vessels, so that hopefully they smooth out and you've got better blood flow in these teeny tiny vessels. And then there's some thought about hyperbaric oxygen. This is a totally different strategy where you're looking at the gut microbiome. So these are the population of bacteria that are in your intestine. And we know that in patients who have long COVID, they tend to have lower populations of certain bacteria, and they have higher populations of other bacteria. And what is that change in the balance of bacteria in your colon doing? And if you look at the function of the gut microbiome in general, we know there's a huge relationship between the bacteria that are in your intestine and potential neurotransmitters and the nervous system control with the vagus nerve. So they talk about the gut-brain axis, and have we shifted that some? There's some relationships with heart disease and the atherosclerosis, which is the hardening of the arteries. There's a very strong relationship between the bacterial system in your colon and whether that's balanced, and are you having manifestations of chronic inflammation in the skin? Like, do you have significant eczema or psoriasis or other skin issues? It can affect the metabolism and different forms of inflammation. You could spend a whole hour certainly talking about this, but I bring this up mostly to say that yes, long COVID screws up your gut. And if it does, there are some tests that we can look at to say, well, what is it doing in your intestine? Not just in general, in theory, but what's it doing for you? And you send stool samples and specifically measure a bunch of the bacteria you expect to be there and a bunch that you really don't want to be there, or that are associated, say, with more autoimmune disease or inflammatory disease. This is just a snapshot of a sample report, but the report itself is 5 pages. So it gives you a lot of information. We know there's a lot of connection between COVID and oxidative stress and glutathione. So I talked about this a little before, but oxidation is basically what's turning this apple brown. And the same thing is happening in your body when you have too much oxidative stress and you've overwhelmed your system's ability to compensate. And this is a diagram of the mitochondria. We talked about them a little bit briefly, but they're teeny tiny organelles that are in every single cell in your body. And so you imagine, and these are where you produce your energy. So if you think about the brain tissue or your skeletal muscle or your heart, those tissues need a lot of energy. So they have a lot more mitochondria in place than some tissues that are a little bit less metabolically active, but every cell in your body has mitochondria. And the mitochondria themselves are specifically more susceptible to oxidative damage than a lot of your other organelles within the cells, and they're less able to repair that damage. And so if you start to have dysfunction in these membranes, then the energy production from the mitochondria is not working. And that's something we need to treat as well. And we can actually look at mitochondrial function and cellular energy production in any individual patient, because you can do a test that looks at some of the metabolites that are picked up in the urine. And when your system is working well, you need to be able to break down fats and carbohydrates and proteins into something called acetyl-CoA, and then this goes into the mitochondria and is processed in every cell with the same set of biochemical steps. in order to create ATP, which is energy. And if something has happened where some of these enzymes aren't working well, then you're not going to have adequate ATP. And people will report symptoms like fatigue or inability to concentrate, or anytime they get up and try and exercise, they just feel really worse and they end up crashing afterwards. And that makes me very concerned about a mitochondrial issue. And you can do testing that specifically looks at this, because if you think about this kind of like traffic on the Beltway, like on 495, if there's an accident on the Beltway, or even just like a slowdown where it gets down to one lane, you'll see a ton of traffic behind everything, but really no cars in front because people can't get around. And if there are multiple accidents on the Beltway, then you just have a lot of cars standing around doing nothing and no one's getting around the circle. We can see that in some biochemical testing that tests for all these different markers. So like, are you successfully converting isocitrate to alpha-ketoglutarate? And if you're not, is this enzyme not working well for you? And that's the traffic jam for you. And there can be multiple enzyme issues. And some of it is a problem with the enzyme itself. Sometimes it's a problem with the cofactors for the enzyme, because the enzyme is what your genes code for. It's a protein. But in order for it to work, it actually binds to other things called cofactors, which are generally nutrients. So there are a lot of B vitamins that are very important for these steps, a lot of trace minerals. Magnesium is a cofactor for tons of enzymes in your body, including a lot in the citric acid cycle. And if some of those aren't working, it'll affect ATP. But if we knew that, then we could direct some pretty significant nutrient therapies to try to correct that. And this is also kind of a complicated diagram, but pretty much I just show this to you to say that somebody actually did a study where they looked at a bunch of long COVID patients and also healthy control patients, and they tested all these markers. And all of the markers that I've highlighted in pink are ones where they realized, oh yeah, the levels of pyruvate are different in long COVID patients, and the levels of lactate and citrate and succinate, they're all different. And these are all these different steps in the citric acid cycle to make ATP. So yeah, ATP does seem to be pretty significantly involved with long COVID symptoms. Oops. And this is a test that tests for these same markers. So I mentioned isocitrate beforehand, and there's the alpha-ketoglutarate, and we can measure those. And if we need to work on this, then we do that with B vitamins and pretty high dose CoQ10 and D-ribose, and there are a number of things that can help support this system. Let's see, I'm going backwards. Okay, then we look at protein synthesis. And I know these are all kind of geeky biochemistry heavy diagrams, but I think it's a little helpful to see some pictures. And if you think about amino acids, they are the building blocks of proteins. And I mean that in the same way that the letters of the alphabet are the building blocks of anything you would want to write. And just like you need all the letters of the alphabet to write a story or to journal article or an email, you need all of the individual amino acids to make a protein. And if I gave you a bunch of letters, but I didn't give you any vowels, you can't make proteins, any proteins. Even if you had 1 million consonants, you really can't do anything with them without the vowels. And the same thing's true of amino acids. And so there's 20 amino acids pretty much in our system that we use, and you need all of them. And that same study that I showed you before with the mitochondrial markers, they also looked at the blood levels of amino acids. And there's some pretty significant changes in some of these blood levels of amino acids. And we won't talk about all of these, but just for right now, we'll talk about tryptophan, which is what the TRP is looking at. And they did see a significant change in the amount of tryptophan available in patients with long COVID. And tryptophan is a really important amino acid in your system. First of all, it's needed for every single protein that you make. And so if you don't have enough protein, or if you don't have enough tryptophan, you're going to have trouble making any protein in your body, any kind of repair protein, any sort of enzyme, any muscle repair, all the neurotransmitters are proteins. So you need protein synthesis to be working for you to be healthy. You also need tryptophan to make serotonin, which is very strongly associated with different mood disorders and is a neurotransmitter in the brain. And then downstream from serotonin is melatonin. And so you need to have adequate tryptophan levels to get adequate melatonin to be able to sleep. And we know that sleep is one of the things that's disrupted with COVID, and so are mood dysfunctions. And an alternative pathway for tryptophan is that if you turn on these enzymes, the IDO enzyme, you can go down an inflammatory pathway towards kynurenine, which causes inflammation in the brain. And one of the enzymes that turns this pathway on in particular is TNF gamma. And that particular enzyme in and of itself is not important, but we'll get back to that in a second. This is another test for where we can look at your tryptophan levels. And so we specifically do a blood test, and it shows us if you have low tryptophan. And if that's the case, we need to replace the tryptophan and your ability to make serotonin and proteins and everything in your system. And a lot of times when the tryptophan is low, it's because it's being diverted down this kynurenine pathway, which is the pathway I told you was for inflammation. And that cytokine that sends things down the inflammatory pathway, right here again. And you guys may or may not be familiar with a gentleman named Bruce Patterson. He's a researcher who had looked a lot into long COVID and some of the side effects or some of the cytokines involved in both severe COVID, like COVID that put people in the hospital, and also long haul COVID that just where the symptoms never cleared. And he did this study where they checked a huge panel of cytokines and they tried to make a mathematical model to identify who has long COVID and is there like a signature for that. And the most significant cytokine that he found was INF gamma, which is the same cytokine that I told you sends a tryptophan down the inflammatory pathway and takes it away from protein synthesis and serotonin and melatonin. Let's see. So you're going back down this pathway. So you're not making proteins, you're not making serotonin, you're not making melatonin, or this is tyramine. This goes back to that same original study where they looked at a bunch of amino acids. And now if we look at tyrosine, which is an entirely different amino acid, tyrosine is very central to your ability to make dopamine, which is your body's reward system. So every time you do something and you feel good, it's dopamine. And every time you eat a little piece of dark chocolate because it makes you feel so good and you want that when you're stressed, it's because you get a little bit of a dopamine hit, and you need that tyrosine to have dopamine. You also need it to have adequate norepinephrine and epinephrine, which are some of your stress neurochemicals in the brain. And you don't want these levels to be sky high, but you do want the ability to make epinephrine if you need it. You don't want it to just be so depleted that you can't respond to something. Tyrosine is also very critical for thyroid hormone. So I use those two samples, tyrosine and tryptophan, as examples of what happens when the amino acid metabolism in your system is off balance. But I showed you there are a whole bunch of amino acids that seem to be affected in long COVID. And if that's the case, then we should be trying to do something to rebalance your amino acids so your body can do what it's supposed to do and make proteins like it's supposed to. And we can check for, this is the test for tyrosine. This is looking at a breakdown product for dopamine, which was also on that chart that we can look for, and breakdown products of the norepinephrine and epinephrine. And I think getting these kinds of tests on patients so you have a better roadmap of where to go to treat them is really helpful. Because if I just did a regular Chem 7 and a CBC on a patient, it's probably not going to give me any insight into how to treat their symptoms. Some of the other mechanisms we think can be involved in COVID or in long COVID. Certainly, we talked before about reactivation of latent infections. So anytime you were to get a cold sore, that cold sore virus has been in your system probably for decades. And it's really when somebody's under an acute stressful event that it comes out and flares and you see a problem from it. prior to that, your immune system was doing a great job of kind of keeping it at bay, and it wasn't really causing you a problem. And COVID can do that same thing for a lot of viruses. So we've seen associations with the reactivation of Epstein-Barr virus, which has been associated with chronic fatigue syndrome in the past. And there's a pretty significant overlap in chronic fatigue or in the ME/CFS, which is myalgic encephalitis / chronic fatigue syndrome. The symptoms of that syndrome is very similar to long COVID. And it's not clear, is that because it reactivates EBV or because reactivation of EBV happens in the same environment that other triggers are happening? But certainly you can reactivate a lot of viruses, and some of these we can test for, and some of it is not so much about the virus itself, but about fixing the underlying reasons why your immune system isn't able to fight it off like it used to. We know that autoimmunity is also an issue and seems to be playing a role. And I wouldn't say that there's a specific treatment that is like the best way to identify autoimmunity or to treat it. There are some tests that we can run that look for different neural antibodies that can be, or antibodies against neural tissues that can be produced. But really it's, how do we decrease the overall inflammatory stress on your body so that we can bring down the tendency for those autoimmune symptoms to flare? And in the same way that someone may come to a functional medicine doctor because they have Crohn's and they want to improve their underlying health so their Crohn's doesn't flare so much and they are on an anti-inflammatory diet, those same types of approaches, I think, may be relevant for some patients with long COVID. So whether these are dietary interventions, like an anti-inflammatory diet, or it's identifying specific food triggers you need to avoid, or environmental effects, or if you have, mold that you've been exposed to and it's making your system a lot more sensitive to everything else. Low-dose naltrexone is a compounded medication that can be used to help modulate it helps modulate the white blood cells and how responsive they are. So I think of like how trigger happy are the white blood cells. And this drug is actually the same drug that people use to reverse narcotics. But instead of giving it in doses of like 50 or 100 in the ER for a narcotic overdose, we're giving it at like 1.5 milligrams or 4.5 milligrams, like very, very low doses. And at those doses, it has more of an effect on modulating your immune system. We can look for toxins that seem to predispose to autoimmunity, because usually autoimmunity isn't the first thing that happened in the line of dominoes that fell over that led to an autoimmune disease. So can we find some of those earlier dominoes and reset those? And then certainly dealing with things like stress management and good sleep hygiene and meditation and other things to ratchet down the stress level a little bit so that you kind of turn down the fire and these things aren't going so out of control. There's concern that autoimmunity may actually be part of the etiology for the dysautonomia that we talked about before and POTS syndrome. When I talked about dysautonomia as the neurologic control of the blood vessels or of the organ systems, and some of that may be damaged by inflammation itself. Some of it may be damaged by the virus's tendency to bind to specific nerves. So neurotropism is the thought that the virus can bind to the nerves itself. Hypovolemia is also a question that may contribute to POTS. That just means you have less blood volume in your system, and that could improve by, being more hydrated and taking more salt in. But that's more POTS symptoms rather than the underlying long COVID etiology. Then I mentioned the cell danger response before, and in general, the cells have an ability to say, hey, something happened and there's a problem, and to set off an alarm. And the function of that alarm is to draw in the white blood cells in your immune system and to activate your body so that it can fight off whatever it is that it needed to fight off. And a lot of things can trigger the cell danger response, whether it's an infection or trauma or different toxins and other things that can trigger this. But once it's triggered, the question is, can you turn it off? And we believe that a persistent cell danger response, which is like basically the alarm won't shut itself off, is part of the cause for ME/CFS, or that chronic fatigue syndrome, which has very similar symptoms to long COVID. So the fatigue and brain fog and exercise intolerance, and a lot of these just overlap very significantly. So what can we do to try to turn down the cell danger response? And this same response has been associated with problems with autism, with the chronic fatigue syndrome, with traumatic brain injury, with Lyme disease. PANDAS is an autoimmune disease triggered by infections. It's generally seen in pediatrics. Like it's seen in a whole host of chronic diseases, but they show these as all different silos because the people that are studying autism are generally very different from the people that are studying Lyme disease or traumatic brain injury or Alzheimer's. And so that some of the insights that they're gaining don't necessarily go across. And if the cell danger response is one of the common roots of all these different chronic illnesses, can we treat the cell danger response and then have an improvement in all sorts of chronic diseases? And I think long COVID is going to be one of these. And some of the ways that I think are reasonable to think about how to turn that down, certainly addressing chronic stress and sleep, like we talked about. SPMs, which I'll show you a picture of in a minute, are specialized pro-resolving mediators that help turn down inflammation. And different ways of promoting the nervous system, or the vagus nervous system, which is the rest and digest side of the nervous system. So different breathing techniques and singing actually help stimulate the vocal cords in a way that stimulates that side of the nervous system. Working on heart rate variability training, which we do some education on at CIH, and limbic retraining systems, which overlap with some of this as well. This just looks at the SPMs. So they're kind of a downstream metabolite of fish oil, and they're part of the body's way of turning off chronic inflammation. And so they can be important in the inflammation from infected cells, or if you've got nets, or a way that neutrophils, which are a type of white cell, can explode and kind of destroy everything around it as a way to try to help save your system. And so SPMs seem to be effective in turning off a lot of inflammatory signals. The other thing I want to talk about briefly was the altered sense of taste and smell. And there was this is a picture of the olfactory epithelium. And so basically the epithelial layer behind your nose that helps you be able to sense smells and taste. And so that's composed of different nerves. So these orange cells are the olfactory neurons. Those are the nerve cells themselves. And then all of these blue cells are called sustenacular cells. And these are the ones that seem to have the ACE2 receptors. And they seem to be the ones that are affected by COVID. And they're kind of like nurse cells that are helping the neurons. So even if the COVID virus didn't actually get into the neuron itself, because the neuron doesn't have any receptors, if it damages those support cells around it that are producing all the growth factors and other things to support those cells, then the nerve stops functioning. And they have seen in some studies where they actually inject platelet-rich plasma, which is just a way of injecting a lot of growth factors into this area to help essentially resuscitate the sustenacular cells, that they're seeing a recovery in a sense of smell. And this was a pretty small study. I don't think we need to get into the details, but my take home when I was looking at this was really that the neurons aren't dead. We just have to figure out the right trigger to help wake up those cells that were essentially dormant and allow them to heal so that you can get better. So where to start? Certainly, I think for any patient, being able to be seen by someone who's going to get a pretty extensive history that includes a lot of their health history from well before COVID is important, and that can help identify different prior infections that may predispose you to issues, different toxins and life stresses or genetic risk factors that are a component to why you got COVID and your spouse didn't, or you got long COVID and they didn't. And then identifying what's unique about those patients, because I told you I don't think it'll just be one cause. I expect this is going to take some time to repair, because I think by the time people have symptoms, there are a lot of dominoes that have fallen over, and you have to find out what are those dominoes for those individual patients. And some of the functional testing that we do can help with that. Some of that looks at the gut microbiome and stool testing and any potential pathogens in the stool, looking at an imbalance in the bacteria that's in the stool, making sure that you're digesting your food well. So if you're not absorbing your nutrients or your amino acids and you can't make proteins, that we figure that out and address it. That we look at your mitochondrial function and the amino acid levels, and we replete whatever needs to be repleted, work on some of the cell danger response triggers and some of the lifestyle factors that are helpful. So getting restorative sleep is just, you're not going to get better without that. So if people are having insomnia, what can we do to help with the insomnia so that they can get that restorative sleep so they can start to heal? I know there's also a lot of alternative approaches that really don't focus so much on the biochemistry, but have been used for millennia to affect cellular health and, total body health. So I think acupuncture has a very long history in China of being able to restore health in patients through mechanisms that we don't fully understand in the West, but that I think are very, very valid. And I would want to have access to all of that. And certainly we have that. We have body work, which I think is really helpful in trying to reset the cell danger response and making people feel safe and calm and relaxed if they've gotten into a state where they just can't relax anymore. And so that can be very helpful. And the whole goal is to really help your body's inherent way of healing. And this is the last slide, but I just show this as a picture because my background actually started in general surgery. And when we used to stitch people up, you put the sutures in and that helps support the surrounding tissue, but it doesn't actually heal the wound. It just provides the support long enough for your body to heal the wound. And I feel like that's what we need to do with COVID, where we need to figure out what are the supports that your body needs so that your body can heal itself from the inside out. So I think that's really everything for me. And I'll start looking at some questions. Let's see. So I see, is there a connection between suddenly developing adult acne after having COVID? And I know we talked about the skin manifestations a little bit kind of early on. And if you have an alteration in the gut microbiome, which is the bacteria in the intestine, that can alter kind of the inflammatory set point in your body, and it can cause underlying inflammation. And some people manifest that in their skin. And so you'll see a pretty significant reaction where people have skin changes or eczema or irritation when their gut's not in alignment. And definitely we see gut disturbances with long COVID. Do you recommend probiotics for the GI issues? I think probiotics can be effective, but the way I describe the gut microbiome is kind of that you're trying to support an ecosystem. And so if you want a nice, diverse ecosystem in your colon, and think of that like a rainforest, well, if something happened that plowed over the rainforest and other bacteria got set up and they're kind of well entrenched and they're like lots and lots of weeds that have overgrown that space, just sprinkling rainforest seeds on it isn't going to restore that biodiversity. You have to do something to kind of cut back what has grown up in its place in order to restore that diversity, and also see if there are other triggers for infection, like you got COVID and that allowed you to have a GI pathogen that set in that threw off your system even more, and we have to find that pathogen and correct that. Would a cleanse help cut back what has grown up in the gut? And there are some herbal protocols that are kind of gut, I don't know if gut cleanse is the right word, but that can help decrease those populations. And then at that point, I think it's easier to reseed with probiotics. And one of the most important things about what bacterial populations grow back up in your colon is what you're eating, because the bacteria that like to eat whatever food you digest are going to be the ones that do really well. And so some of it's diet, and some of it can be helped with probiotics, but not just probiotics. Certainly fermented foods can be helpful as well. Let's see. Have you seen a connection between long COVID and cardiac health, and particularly a decline in cardiac function? Certainly we've seen COVID be associated with inflammation in the heart itself, so myocarditis. And I saw more severe manifestations of that when I was in the ICU. But since the heart is such a metabolically active organ, you need really good mitochondrial function for your heart to be working well. And so if the mitochondria has been impacted, I would expect that to have some manifestations in the heart. The heart also requires good oxygen flow. And so if people are having compromise either with microclots or some irritation or damage in the endothelial lining of the capillaries, anything that disrupts the capillaries is going to have cardiac impacts. The nitric oxide function that I talked about for how your vessels dilate and constrict is also going to be important. So yeah, I think there are a lot of potential connections to the heart, but I couldn't tell you just based on that snippet which one it might be in you, but there's certainly a lot of ways. What's a good way to support mitochondria? So if I was looking at a test that said, definitely this patient has mitochondrial problems, some of the things that we need are B vitamins and magnesium. There's some trace minerals, molybdenum and selenium are really important. You need some zinc. D-ribose is one of the backbones for creating ATP, so you need adequate ATP. But if your mitochondria have indeed been really impacted, sometimes a bunch of the mitochondria have basically been disassembled, where your body just said, hey, I give up and we're not going to keep those factories open because we don't have enough energy to keep all the lights on. And if that's the case, you sometimes need free-form amino acids to help stimulate mitochondrial regeneration or biogenesis. So that can be a part of it too. Your recommendation for fibrinolytic for microclots from a functional medicine standpoint, patient is on heparin, so not sure if there's much more you can recommend. So heparin is one of the anticoagulants that's sort of like warfarin or Coumadin, which affects the clotting factors. So those are the different proteins that tell your body, hey, form a clot here. But then, and heparin affects that, and so does warfarin, and so do a number, like apixaban affects that system as well. The fibrin products that we're talking about, one of them is called Baluchi or lumbrokinase or nattokinase. There are a number of things that just help it be a little bit easier to break down the fibrin. They're not going to just completely dissolve the fibrin like the high dose fibrinolytics you would use in the ER. So that is an entirely different class of medication, because you're not going to get TPA from a supplement store, but you can get nattokinase and you could get lumbrokinase, which can help restore normal function, because your body always has fibrin. You should always have fibrin, and there's always a balance of building up the fibrin and breaking it down. And so you want that system to be in balance. Yeah. And Jen, I don't know if you had any other questions that came in, but that's what I see.
Sorry, I don't see any other questions.
Okay. Well, thanks everybody for coming. I appreciate it, and I hope this was helpful to you. I'm certainly here at CIH, so if anybody has any questions, you know how to reach me. And I think this is, I think it's a very exciting field, and it affects a lot of patients. So I'm hoping to get more experience in getting people well, because I've certainly seen people be sick from this for a long time. So, thanks.